Imagine you're at like a block party, right? All the neighbors are out, kids are running around, everyone's having a good time.
Sounds lovely.
It is, it is. But here's a thought. Statistically, 1 in every 100 men at that party could be on the sex offender registry.
Wow, that's a pretty jarring statistic. Definitely makes you think.
It does, right. And that's what we're diving into today, the sex offender registry. We all want to keep our communities safe, but is this system really doing what it's supposed to?
It's a complex issue for sure, and there's a lot of debate about whether the registry actually makes us safer or if it creates more problems than it solves.
Exactly. So, to guide our deep dive, we're looking at a couple of sources, a really thought-provoking article by Michael Hobbs for the Huffington Post, and a fascinating conversation he had with Sarah Marshall on their podcast, You're Wrong About.
Both great sources for getting different perspectives on this issue.
Absolutely. And they both do a great job of highlighting the human impact of the registry, beyond the statistics and legal jargon.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that we're talking about real people's lives, and the consequences can be devastating.
Right. And to really understand that, we need to look at some individual stories. Hobbs introduces us to Brock, a 24-year-old guy whose life completely changed because of a file he downloaded.
Oh, what happened?
Well, he thought the file showed a 16-year-old girl, but the prosecution claimed she was actually 14, which led to much more serious charges.
So just that small difference in age had a huge impact on his case.
Exactly. And it shows how even a slight discrepancy in perceived age can have these, life-altering consequences.
It makes you wonder about intent versus outcome, right? Like, did he intentionally download child pornography, or was it a mistake based on a mislabeled file?
And that's something the registry doesn't really consider. It's just a label without much nuance.
Right. And for Brock, that label meant losing his job, becoming homeless, getting separated from his family. It was a total domino effect.
It really highlights that ripple effect, how the registry impacts families and communities, not just the individual on it.
It's a powerful reminder that we're not just talking about abstract legal concepts, but real people whose lives are being deeply affected.
Exactly. And another story that really drives this home is about Lewis, who spent 8 years in prison for molesting his daughter.
That's a tough one. And it probably brings up a lot of assumptions people have about sex offenders.
It does. Most people assume that anyone who commits a crime against a child is a pedophile.
Great. Like, that's the automatic label.
Yeah, but it's not always that simple. Hobbs points out that pedophilia specifically refers to a primary sexual attraction to prepubescent children.
So there can be other reasons why someone might offend against a child.
Exactly. And in Lewis's case, it seems like it stemmed from a really complicated mix of things, like his wife's infidelity and a sense of betrayal. It doesn't excuse his actions, of course.
Of course not. But it does add some nuance to the situation.
Right, and it challenges that automatic assumption that everyone who commits this type of crime fits neatly into the pedophile box.
So it's not always about a sexual attraction to children, but about other factors like power dynamics and vulnerability.
Yeah, and Hobbes actually draws a parallel to the clergy abuse scandals, where you often see those same power dynamics at play.
It's about someone in a position of authority taking advantage of someone who's vulnerable.
Exactly. And it highlights how important it is to understand the context and individual circumstances of each case.
Instead of just slapping on a label and assuming we know the whole story.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key issue, reintegration. Even after Lewis served his time, he faced huge challenges trying to rebuild his life.
Because of his status on the registry?
Yep. Landlords wouldn't rent to him. Employers wouldn't hire him. It's like the punishment never really ends.
So in a way, the registry itself creates obstacles to rehabilitation.
Right. It makes you wonder if this system is really designed to help people reintegrate into society, or if it's more about, keeping them ostracized and marginalized.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Because if we're serious about reducing recidivism, about preventing people from reoffending, we need to provide support and opportunities for them to rebuild their lives.
Otherwise, it's like we're setting them up for failure.
And potentially putting communities at risk. It's like this unintended consequence of a system that's supposed to be about safety.
It is, right. And that actually ties into a lot of the misconceptions surrounding sex offenders. Like, for example, that whole stranger danger narrative we grew up with.
The idea that most abuse comes from some creepy stranger lurking in the bushes.
Exactly. But the data paints a very different picture. Hobbs and Marshall point out that only 7% of abuse cases actually involve strangers.
7%. That's a lot lower than I would guess.
Right, it's pretty shocking.
Huh.
And here's another one. 40% of abuse in children under 12 is perpetrated by other children.
Wow, that's a really disturbing statistic.
It is. And it highlights how important it is to understand the cyclical nature of abuse, how kids who have been abused themselves might then act out against other kids.
So it's not just about identifying bad guys, but about recognizing the complex factors that contribute to abuse.
Exactly. And this is where things like comprehensive sex education and early intervention programs come in. We need to be teaching kids about healthy boundaries and relationships from a young age.
So they can recognize and report abuse and also understand how to avoid becoming abusers themselves.
Absolutely. And here's another statistic that challenges our assumptions about the registry. Only 14% of registered sex offenders nationwide are considered high risk to children.
So the vast majority aren't actually considered a major threat.
Right. And that raises some serious questions about the effectiveness of this broad brush approach where everyone on the registry is treated as a dangerous predator.
It's like we're casting this huge net, but most of the people caught in it aren't the ones we should be worried about.
Exactly. And we also can't ignore the racial disparities within the registry. Did you know that 1 in every 100 black men in the U.S. is registered as a sex offender?
Wow, that's a staggering number. It really points to the systemic biases in our criminal justice system.
It does. It makes you wonder if the registry is disproportionately targeting certain communities, regardless of actual risk.
It's a huge concern, and it adds another layer of complexity to this whole issue.
So we're seeing that the registry might not be the simple solution it appears to be. There are a lot of unintended consequences and ethical questions that need to be addressed.
Definitely. We need to have a more nuanced and informed discussion about this, moving beyond the fear and sensationalism that often dominates the conversation.
I agree. And that's exactly what we're going to do after a quick break. But first, we want to hear from you. What are your initial thoughts on the sex offender registry? Do these statistics challenge your assumptions? Share your reflections with us on social media, and we'll be back in a moment to continue this important conversation.
So we're back and ready to dig a little deeper into the sex offender registry. We've talked about some of the unintended consequences and how it might not be as effective as we think.
It's definitely more complicated than it seems on the surface, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just about, punishing people. It's about what happens after, like reintegration and how we can actually create a safer society.
That's a good point. We focused a lot on the problems, but what are some potential solutions? Like, how do we move beyond just punishment and actually address the root causes of abuse?
Well, Hobbs and Marshall bring up some interesting ideas in their conversation. One thing they talk about is specialized halfway houses for sex offenders.
Halfway houses, okay. How would that work?
Basically, these facilities would offer counseling and job training and just a more supportive environment to help people transition back into society.
It's like giving them the tools and resources they need to rebuild their lives,
Yeah,
rather than just throwing them back into the world with, like, a scarlet letter.
exactly. And stable housing is a huge part of that. We talked about how Brock was constantly getting evicted because of his status on the registry.
Yeah, it seemed like every time he got back on his feet, something would knock him back down.
Right. So subsidized housing could be another way to prevent homelessness and all the instability that comes with it.
It seems kind of counterintuitive, though, right? Like,
Yeah.
a system designed to protect communities ends up pushing people into these vulnerable situations where they're, like, more likely to reoffend.
It's definitely a paradox, and it speaks to the need for a more holistic approach.
And what about employment? That seemed to be a huge barrier for Lewis.
Yeah, it's tough for anyone with a criminal record to find work, let alone someone on the sex offender registry. So Hobbs and Marshall suggest creating programs that connect sex offenders with employers who are willing to give them a second chance.
So not just leaving them to fend for themselves, but actively helping them find jobs.
Right, because a stable job can be a huge factor in preventing recidivism. It gives people a sense of purpose and routine and financial stability.
It's recognizing that these individuals can actually contribute positively to society if given the opportunity.
Exactly. But of course, changing public perception is a big hurdle. There's so much fear and stigma around this issue.
It's tough, right? Like, how do you convince people that these alternative approaches are worth considering?
It takes education and open dialogue. We need to challenge those deeply ingrained misconceptions about sex offenders and highlight the evidence that supports these more rehabilitation-focused strategies.
So it's about shifting the mindset from, like, fear and punishment to understanding and restoration.
Exactly. And it's about holding institutions accountable, too. Remember the clergy abuse scandals we talked about earlier?
Yeah, where the people in power were often protected from consequences.
Right. Addressing those systemic issues that allow abuse to flourish is just as important as addressing individual offenders.
So it's a multifaceted approach, right? Changing societal norms, promoting open communication, and creating support systems for both victims and offenders.
Exactly. True prevention requires us to address those power dynamics, foster healthy relationships, and provide resources for those who have been harmed or who are at risk of harming others.
It's a complex process, but it's about creating a culture where abuse is not tolerated in any form.
Right. And recognizing that there's no easy fix. It's going to take a lot of work and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
This has been really eye-opening. We've talked about the shortcomings of the current system and the need for more nuanced solutions, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
You're right. This is a topic that deserves a lot more attention and discussion.
Definitely. And we need to keep digging deeper. It's like we've uncovered this whole hidden world, this system that's so deeply embedded in our society, but we don't really talk about it.
Yeah, it's almost like it's operating in the shadows.
And it's been driven by this tough on crime mentality, this fear of being seen as soft on offenders.
Right, like it's become this political tool.
Yeah. And it's created this system where people are basically punished forever, you know, often for one mistake with very little chance of redemption.
It's like a life sentence, even after they've served their time.
Exactly. And going back to that statistic about black men, 1 in 100 being on the registry,
Yeah, that's a chilling reminder of how our criminal justice system is just riddled with these systemic biases.
it's like who gets labeled and how harshly they're punished. It's not always about the crime itself.
No, it's about race and class and all these other factors that shouldn't play a role.
And when you think about it, most people on the registry are first-time offenders.
Which makes you wonder, is this really about rehabilitation and public safety?
Or is it more about, like, perpetuating this cycle of punishment and exclusion?
It's a good question, and it's like we're so focused on this idea of stranger danger.
Right, like that's the bogeyman we've all been taught to fear.
But as we've seen, the reality is much more complicated. Child sexual abuse is often hidden, it's happening within families and communities, perpetrated by people we know.
So this focus on strangers might actually be diverting attention and resources away from where they're really needed.
It's like we're looking in the wrong direction, focusing on this scary but statistically less likely threat.
It seems like we need to shift gears, move
Yeah.
away from just reacting to individual cases and start looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, we need to understand the systemic factors that allow abuse to happen in the first place.
Like power imbalances and societal norms that kind of minimize or even condone abuse.
And we need to hold institutions accountable.
Right, not just individuals.
It's about moving beyond those easy answers, the tough on crime slogans, and actually creating a culture of prevention.
It's a tough conversation, but it's one we need to have.
Absolutely. If we really want to protect children, we need to be honest about where the dangers lie and what solutions actually work.
Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about.
Me too. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
We've really had to challenge some of our own assumptions and confront some uncomfortable truths.
But that's what this is all about, right? Examining these complex issues with nuance and honesty.
Because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing, a world where children are safe and everyone has the chance to live a life of dignity and purpose.
Absolutely. And it's going to take all of us working together to get there.
This conversation doesn't end here, though. We encourage you to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep talking about these issues.
Because the more we understand, the better equipped we'll be to create real and lasting change.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the sex offender registry.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.